This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a Henry Luce Foundation-funded project hosted by Northeastern University that promotes public scholarship on religion. I highly recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website, sacred-rights.org, that's WRITES, or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. The intertwined nature of weddings, being married, and divorce with religious laws and traditions is deep. And this interconnection and interpretations of marriage and divorce seems to change based on the internal diversity of religions, the cultural context in which a relationship is occurring, and the ways a local culture can inspire changes to something once thought firmly unchangeable. The way the world changes at such a fast clip makes the needs of people within marriages change as well, and thus, traditions tend to adapt. My guest on this episode is Dr. Kecia Ali, and the topic of our conversation is weddings, being married, and divorce within Islam. Ali is professor of religion at Boston University, where she teaches a range of classes on Islam. Her research focuses on Islamic law, women and gender, ethics, and biography. Among her many books, one for which she edited and wrote is the recently compiled reader, Half of Faith, American Muslim Marriage and Divorce in the 21st Century. Half of Faith gathers a selection of previously published and newly written materials on Muslim marriage and divorce in 21st century America. Contributors engage marriage contracts, wedding customs, dower norms, divorce practices, and experiences of polygyny, illuminating aspects of and disagreements within American Muslim life and thought. Dr. Kecia Ali can be found on Twitter at Kecia_Ali, and Half of Faith can be downloaded free of charge at KeciaAli.com. So without further delay, please enjoy my conversation on being married and divorce within Islam with Dr. Kecia Ali. Dr. Kecia Ali, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
I'm delighted to have you. I'm wondering if you can just spend a moment and introduce yourself to the audience however you see fit.
Sure. My name is Kecia Ali. I'm a professor of religion and chair of the religion department at Boston University and an expert on Islamic law and gender.
Wonderful. Well, I'm curious a little bit about how you came to hold the areas of expertise that you do, because your career is fairly wide-ranging. I know that you are interested in Islamic law, women, gender, ethics, and biography. And I'm curious about how you came to be interested in these topics in the first place. And I'm just curious a little bit about your story and your stepping stones along your journey. You know what I mean?
It's been kind of a wild ride. I did my Ph.D. at Duke and actually started out as an historian before I shifted over to religious studies. And in some ways, that training, the habits of mind that studying history inculcates in you, end up being very useful to any attempt to understand phenomena on their own terms. And looking at the past helps you really see the present as strange, see the current state of affairs as not inevitable. And that really dovetails with my feminist commitments, the desire to explain how we got here, but also understand that we could have ended up somewhere else and in fact still can. So I was always interested in women and gender and became interested in Islam as an undergraduate didn't have as many opportunities as I would have liked for studying Islamic history and Islamic tradition at Stanford, where I did my undergrad, but chose to pursue that more fully at Duke. And again, there, having been studying history, I was really interested in both where we are at the present moment and what the roots of that are, right?
Gotcha.
What are the legal underpinnings? What are the ethical norms in place? What are the assumptions underlying those norms? And so I would say I'm first and foremost a law nerd, but in my teaching and to a lesser extent my writing, I actually try actively to decenter the jurisprudential text to recognize other complementary and competing discourses and patterns. And that includes ethics, which are central to Islamic legal thinking. It includes prophetic biography or seerah. And always, always, all of those things are gendered.
Mm. Why Islam? Why the history of Islam? What got you interested in that topic in the first place?
Well, number one, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And number two, I'm Muslim.
Okay.
And so those things dovetail.
Wonderful. Whenever I got in touch with you, you sent me a book that you recently compiled, which turned out to be sort of a passion project during the pandemic, is what I get the impression of. And the book is so interesting to me. I've been enjoying reading it because it's just something that I haven't thought a whole heck of a lot about, but is very relevant to my life where I am currently in this stage of my life. So the book is called Half of Faith, American Muslim Marriage and Divorce in the 21st Century. And, I had a few pandemic projects that have kept me going and focused and moving forward and feeling creative the last year and a half. And I'm wondering if you can just tell me a little bit about the origin story of this book that you have recently put out.
So I blame Dr. Amina Al-Din. So early in 2021, I had a long Zoom chat with this illustrious senior scholar from DePaul, whom I've known casually and interacted with a few times. And she said, look, we need to gather some people. We need to do something on American Muslims, on women, on law. And I mean, I agreed with her, but also I have two overdue book manuscripts and, it's the middle of a pandemic and I'm chair of my department. And, everybody I know is overextended, overstretched, colleagues with school-aged children and small children pulled in a million directions. So I couldn't imagine starting from scratch. But I realized as I thought more about this conversation that there's actually all this wonderful work that exists, but is kind of scattered, or it's published in odd places, or it's difficult to find if you don't have access to an academic library.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, well, I'm not sure I can convene a new conversation, but how about if we revisit what exists, we pull some things together and we make them accessible to a new audience. Now, ultimately, in the end, both Dr. Al-Din and my Dartmouth colleague, Dr. Zahra Ayubi, wrote new essays for the volume, responding to current community needs. One is about marriage guardians for new converts, and another is about what to consider if you're thinking about divorce as a Muslim woman. But it's my hope that people who come to this volume will also take a look at some of these other publications, which go back in some cases 20 years, and really reflect a kind of dialogue among ourselves and with other scholars and with interlocutors elsewhere in the community.
Mm. Something I was reading your introduction the other day as well to the volume, and you write a bit about how marginalization played a role in the creation of the book. And I was wondering if I could just get your thoughts in real time, if you could explain that a little more to me, because I found that statement in the intro to be quite captivating.
So there's a really troubling tendency, I think, to look to men who've been positioned as community authorities, as experts on Muslim marriage, and not necessarily look at the empirical, the theoretical, the textual work that women scholars have done in communities. And so the six of us whose work is in this volume are only scratching the surface of the Muslim women scholars who've worked on these kinds of questions. But even there was a book's worth, right? And I think that part of what we're trying to do with this volume is say, hey, some of this work already exists. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And also, I think we're saying Muslim women's needs and concerns are not identical, certainly. There's a tremendous amount of diversity among American Muslims. But taken on the whole, on average, women do tend to have different concerns in thinking about marriage and divorce from people who aren't women. And that's part of what we wanted to do, was to really center women's needs and experiences, and also women's scholarship.
You know, something that I'm thinking about here all of a sudden is the book is taking place in an entirely American context. And I'm wondering if this is something that you think that there are similar pieces from countries around the world where you could do half of faith, British Muslim marriage and divorce in the 21st century, and Canadian Muslim marriage. And I'm just giving you projects now, aren't I?
You really are, but they're other people's projects, and I would love to help facilitate them. And I think they absolutely could be done. And you name 3 English-speaking contexts where Muslims are minorities, but you could write that book for Pakistan. You could write that book for Nigeria. You could write that book for India. You could write that book for Egypt. In each of these contexts, you have a really fascinating interplay between at least 2 legal systems, right? So a state legal system, a religious legal system, and a set of cultural expectations and norms that may align with or diverge from these systems. And in each of these contexts, it's going to be complicated. But in all of them, there are going to be some persistent tensions and some recurring threads.
Okay, gotcha. Great. Well, so one of these topics is relevant to my life right now, and I want to start with the end of marriage. Why divorce? What is it about divorce that drew you to this particular topic within the book? I'm curious about like this part of the book in particular.
It's actually really difficult, I think, to separate out divorce from marriage or divorce from weddings, speaking specifically in a Muslim context, but I think for other Americans as well. Part of what we're talking about when we're talking about Muslim marriage is we're talking about a contract. And one of the things you do if you are a lawyer is when you draft a contract, you imagine its dissolution, right? And you put in penalties for breach, and you think about, when has this run its course, how would you dissolve it? And I think Americans really don't like to think about that, Muslim or otherwise. And to some extent, this is sort of a concern in the modern world, but I also think it's part of a very particularly Christian notion about marriage as sort of eternal and lifelong and perhaps persisting. And so there's a sort of romanticization of lifelong pair bonding that makes it hard to conceptualize divorce as part of marriage. And yet, a lot of marriages end in divorce. And so you can't really talk about one without talking about the other. Definitely part of what we're trying to do is participate in destigmatizing, not so much destigmatizing divorce, but destigmatizing the discussion of divorce, right? Because it is a reality, it exists. So let's talk frankly about it, and let's talk about it in ways that help women and children and families get what they need.
I'm curious about if there's anything specific that differentiates Muslim marriage from, you mentioned Christianity a little bit ago and the Christian conception of divorce in the US. I'm wondering if there's any major differences between the two that are some basics that you think that everybody should know.
Oh boy, that's an hours long conversation. Look, I think one place to begin um, is by acknowledging how weird marriage in America is compared to many places in the world.
Ooh, interesting.
Which is to say, in America, you can get married by your priest. You can get married by your rabbi. And if they are registered with the state, the government of this country is going to recognize your marriage as valid, right? That's weird. They don't do that in France. They don't do that in Brazil. They don't do that in Egypt, right?
Ooh,
So we talk about how America separates church and state, et cetera, but this is really a weird and strange thing. Now, what we don't do is we don't let that priest dissolve the marriage, right? So you can have a marriage solemnized or witnessed by a religious authority figure, but that same person is not empowered to do the dissolution of the marriage. For that, you have to go to court. So there's an asymmetry there. In Muslim contexts, in the modern world, you very frequently have parallel processes, right? If you want to have some kind of religiously ceremonialized marriage, you can do that. But then you also mostly have to go to the state and get some kind of separate state documentation. Some people get the state documentation, but the religious ceremony isn't necessarily solemnized by someone who is a recognized clerical figure. Instead, it can be an interpersonal contract, right? Somebody from the family might negotiate, because this is an interpersonal agreement that can also be dissolved without reference to the state authorities. So one problem that emerges, and this has been an issue in Pakistan, it's an issue in Egypt, you find laws regarding it all over the place, is what do you do if you say this is a contract two people can dissolve on their own, either by mutual agreement or by a male initiated pronouncement, right? Repudiation, that famous I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, right? It's a stereotype, but there is a provision in law where, things at least at one level can be said to work that way. What do you do about that? What do you do if there's a divorce and you don't go file paperwork with the state? It's like the opposite of common law marriage, right? How do you grapple with that recognition? And so one of the challenges that Muslims face in the US is, if you register a marriage, but then there is a non-judicial divorce, what happens there? Right? How do you address this? Who's married? Who's not married? And so this is an issue of how you have kind of competing and intersecting norms and systems. And it's not only an issue for Muslims in America, it's an issue worldwide, where you have these competing understandings of what makes a legitimate marriage, what do you require for divorce. You have it in the US when you talk about common law marriage, and it comes to the fore in almost all of these cases when you're talking about who has certain rights, who gets to inherit, who gets to visit someone in intensive care, right? All of these kinds of things come up when your ideas of who's your spouse, who's your family, comes into conflict with the state's ideas of who's your spouse, who's your family, and how you apportion rights and responsibilities.
You just said so many things that I have never even considered about valid marriage, valid divorce, and all these things. This is all completely brand new to me. So I just love this because it's just such an interesting topic about things that I'm personally going through. And I've never thought about these things. So it kind of makes me feel like more of an adult to learn about the ways that the world operates around me at all times that I've never had to pay attention to. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Sure, absolutely.
I just love that. I'm wondering if divorce is among Muslim couples is like a relatively new topic of study, or if it's been, growing in attention with each passing year, or how the scholarly community is talking about this issue. Is this kind of a new thing? Is this growing in focus?
There's a lot of scholarship on this. There's scholarship about this from the 10th century. Joseph
Mm,
Rappaport has an excellent book. Julie McFarlane has a book about Muslim divorce in North America. One of the colleagues who's got several articles in the book, Dr. Zahra Ayubi, actually wrote about this for her award-winning undergraduate honors thesis and has published on it. Divorce is really common, and there are plenty of times and places in Muslim history where it's not stigmatized.
mm,
And then there are other times and places where it is. And so that's part of what I'm interested
yeah.
in is sort of understanding all the ways that Muslims are basically just like their neighbors,
Yeah.
right? So the places where divorce is less common and more problematic ideologically tend to be places where other folks think divorces should be rare and is a problem.
I noticed in the book that you have a personal chapter in the weddings section and in the being married section, essentially, but you don't have one in the divorce section. And I was wondering if that's like an area that you're going to be writing on more in the future.
So I have written about divorce in my book on marriage and slavery in early Islam. That's chapter
Mm-hmm.
4. Um, but I don't anticipate doing field research,
Okay.
either personal or ethnographic research on divorce. I'm coming up on 30 years of marriage, and I would just as soon keep it that way.
Excellent. Excellent. So the book discusses the varied experiences of American Muslim women in weddings, being married, and leaving marriages from the past like 2 decades. And some of the articles are old and some of the articles are new, like you mentioned just a little bit ago. And I'm wondering what the experience was like for you, and what was interesting about selecting the pieces and topics that might have been contained, and if there was any discussion with the authors about any of the information being possibly outdated, and how you may have, worked with some of those possibly outdated things, and how you all approached that as this collection came together.
There was at least twice as much material that we could have included.
Mm-hmm.
There are plenty of other folks that I could have also approached. This is really just the tip of an iceberg. And our conversations were really about showing the breadth of experience of American Muslim women, but also highlighting some ongoing scholarly conversations. So yeah, some of the statistics are perhaps a little bit dated. Some of the cases may have been superseded in terms of subsequent rulings about, say, enforcement of dower and so forth. But as you'll see, the conversations are really, I think, ongoing about what are the tactics that Muslim women should use in framing their marriage contracts? Are there conditions that serve as a useful way of guaranteeing certain kinds of rights? What sorts of strategic appeal do we want to make to certain kinds of norms encoded in classical texts of Muslim jurisprudence? How do we want to deal with unregistered marriages, with polygamy? What are the things that are broadly of concern? And even though, as I said, some of the specific information might be dated, I think those debates, if anything, haven't come as far as one might like. And I think part of the reason they haven't come as far as one might like is that we are not having them in a kind of sustained way. People are picking up pieces of the conversation here and there, but I think a lot of the proposals and a lot of the ideas sort of get out there, circulate very narrowly to the extent that they circulate at all, and then sort of get dropped. And I think, you see this, my article in 2003 from Progressive Muslims makes some pretty bold claims about the use of dower and the model of a sales contract, and sort of why this is a problem for progressive and feminist Muslims thinking about Muslim marriage. It's only 10 years later that Professor Asifa Qureshi has an article where she basically says, yeah, Kecia's wrong. Like, she can be all pie in the sky and idealist, but let me explain exactly why this is so useful and why we should shift to, yes, moving from sales to partnership, but upholding these particular kinds of rights. But it's not the kind of sustained conversation, in part, I think, because most of us are also doing other things along the way.
So, you, as the editor of the volume, I know that there are some blurbs that some of the authors wrote to start off their chapters. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about those, how they may have like set some context for what was going on. How did you guide the process with the other collaborators?
That was the most fun,
I'm sure,
that I had. That and working with Komal Zehra, who was the designer, who did a really, really wonderful job for us. She is, among other things, a graphic designer, and she works with the Shia Racial Justice Coalition. And she, put everything together so beautifully and made it accessible so you could use an e-reader, right, with these old sort of janky hand scans and PDFs and whatever else. So the whole thing really works. But apart from that, my favorite thing was putting these blurbs together, because it really gave each of us an opportunity to reflect on what it is we thought we were doing at the time with these different pieces of work, what we were responding to. You'll see that several articles actually, several blurbs or introductions to the articles actually reference the No Alters piece that Professor Qureshi and Dr. Najiba Saeed put together. That comes late in the article, late in the volume. And I think if you read nothing else in the book but those introductory blurbs, that really gives you a sense of this conversation taking shape over time.
And something else that I was really wondering about, and you mentioned this earlier, talking about the internal diversity of the needs of Muslim women. And, you mentioned that a recurring theme in the book, and I'm just going to read your own words to you here because you said it nicely. Some models of marriage and family upheld by Muslim community members and religious authorities are out of step with women's diverse realities and needs. And so this was a really powerful quote for me as I was processing what you were saying in the book. And I'm wondering if you can just say a little bit more about that, about where we are now in the year 2021, as sort of as a country on these issues, and kind of what you're currently thinking about with regards to where we are today.
Well, I mean, in 2021, right, I didn't think we would still be here in terms of a pandemic,
right,
in the fall of 2021. But I think that what we've seen with this pandemic is that the effects of national policies don't hit people equally, right? The effects of not having universal health care hit people really unequally. The effect of not having childcare available hit people really unequally. And the same is true for national laws about marriage, about child support, about health insurance, right? All of the things that we think about as sort of related to a specific family are in fact big picture policies that matter for who can afford to get married, who can afford to get divorced, what resources they have available to them. So for instance, Dr. Deborah Majid's contribution to the volume is her afterword from her book on polygyny, which is the only full-length study of African-American Muslim women in polygynous marriages. And what she does in that volume, which is so important, is she begins from Black Muslim women's experiences of being in and sometimes leaving polygynous marriages. And what she talks about in her study, and also specifically in her contribution to the volume, is what's really practically useful and necessary for women in a particular community and within the US, right? Are laws that criminalize polygamy helpful or harmful for these women? Is it helpful to have the imam, and by the way, she thinks criminalizing polygamy is bad for women, right? Is it helpful to have a model marriage contract that covers polygyny? Is it helpful to require the imam of a mosque to talk to a first wife, right? Whenever anybody talks about polygyny and talks about women's experiences of polygyny, very often what you have is somebody saying, well, men technically, Islamically, aren't required to get their first wife's permission. Well, I'm actually not interested in that. I'm interested in thinking about what does it mean to have a conversation that centers women's experiences. And so that's part of what I mean in this context. And of course, polygyny is a very, very small fraction of Muslim marriages in the US context or globally.
Sure.
But it's a good example of how a one-size-fits-all model doesn't really work.
Excellent. So I am a high school teacher of religious studies. So I always love having conversations with professors because it sort of is like a bridge between secondary and post-secondary education. So we kind of like bridge these little worlds, which I love doing. And something I often like to ask my guests is to imagine that you were to come and be like a guest speaker with my high school class. And, you know, one of my students was asking you questions about, well, I don't really know anything about this and how it relates to, you know, scripture or the Qur'an or holy texts or anything like that. And they were wanting you to suggest some things that they could read from, you know, within, you know, holy scripture and texts that might set them off on a path of curiosity to learning about these topics. So what would you suggest for young people who are brand new to these topics to maybe dive into if they wanted to just get their feet wet, so to speak, in these studies?
The most important thing I find in teaching about women, gender, sexuality, marriage, divorce in Muslim contexts, especially if we're starting from scripture or the classical tradition, is that it be comparative. So what I think is really important is that you don't compare 7th century Arab texts and norms to 21st century American norms, especially idealized versions, right, of what egalitarian marriage is like in 21st century America. Egalitarian and not necessarily realistic ideas. So I think it would be very important to have this be part of a unit that looks, say, at marriage in the Bible, marriage in ancient Jewish communities, marriage in early Christian communities, marriage among early Muslims. So with that said, so comparative sort of cross tradition, but then also comparative over time, so that, yes, you're looking at scripture and maybe what it meant to some of its early interpreters, but then you're also looking at the range of contemporary interpretations, including feminist interpretations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to teach Genesis, you should teach Judith Plasko and the Coming of Lilith. If you're going to teach portions of the Qur'an on marriage and divorce, a good place to start would be with Amina Wadud, Qur'an and Woman. So Dr. Wadud has written broadly about women in scripture, and specifically about creation, which is a place to begin there. If you're looking for very specific examples, there are short passages in Islam, the Key Concepts, which I co-authored with Oliver Leaman 10 years ago. I have an encyclopedia article on marriage, family, and sexual ethics that addresses the Quran and more than that could be excerpted. Not sure it's really high school, but it would work for college freshmen. Yeah, I think the caveat, though, is that it really has to be contextualized.
Sure. And it's very complex, too. I love the idea of grouping it thematically, where you're doing several different traditions sort of at once, so that, there's like the comparative nature seems to be so important there, because it will give students a wide variety of experiences that they can then see like, whoa, this is complex, and jumping to my own, preconceived conclusions on any one of these is a bad idea. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think that skill of comparison, and in particular, being mindful of comparing apples and apples, right? That you don't look at other people's realities against your own ideals, or medieval texts against modern, and that you also recognize the internal diversity of each of these traditions. Like, I think I said the phrase biblical marriage. Well, that's a really super contentious phrase, right? And sort of thinking about what that means and what that actually looks like and how it's been weaponized, right? The same kinds of interpretive skills that you would use to look at where the Quran talks about marriage and what it has to say are also skills that would be really helpful for looking at the different biblical models of marriage and where they come from and what they've been used for and by whom.
Wonderful. Well, you have a pretty distinguished career at this point. You've mentioned several of your books. You've mentioned that you are the department head of your department. I mean, your work is out there, and you've been doing this work for a long time. And I'm wondering what it is. So you and I came together through the Sacred Rights 2021 cohort. And I'm wondering, at this point in your career, because you've been on, like, I've seen interviews with you, like on YouTube, you've done like book conversations, and so your work is out there. And I'm wondering what Sacred Rights is doing for you as a person with so many experiences behind you, and how this experience of being a part of this cohort of other scholars is helping you at this point in your career.
There's a new field of study and learning called science communication, right? Which isn't about doing the science, it's about figuring out how to explain it cogently to non-specialists. And sacred rights is basically religion communication, not in the sense of proselytism, but in the sense of giving us tools and skills for communicating what we do to non-specialists. As scholars, we're trained to always express the caveat, right? Always be sure to capture all the nuance, never to generalize too broadly, right? To make sure to satisfy the nitpickiest of nitpicky specialists. And you can't do that in a 5-minute radio interview.
Right.
And it's so frustrating, right? But thinking about what is so essential to communicate about what it is we do that's been something that Sacred Rights has been really helpful for.
I love it. What are you working on next for the general public? I'm curious what some of your goals are within the field of public scholarship.
Well, on Wednesday, which will probably be past by the time this airs, I'm delivering the Dr. Rana Akbar Memorial Lecture on Muslim women, unity and diversity in a global tradition. So you can see that's sort of a theme
Fabulous.
in my work at Saginaw Valley State University. And my understanding is it will be posted after the fact online.
Okay.
And that is really, I hope, a kind of overview or an entry point into some of the work that I'm doing. And it draws from a book that I'm writing that's meant to be an intro book for the classroom on women in Muslim traditions.
Excellent. And, I'm wondering about the accessibility of the reader that we talked about earlier, Half of Faith, American Muslim Marriage and Divorce in the 21st Century. I'm wondering where people can find that if they're curious to know more about the collection that we talked about.
Absolutely. It is open access. It is hosted at BU's library. If you Google my name and Half of Faith, it will come up. It will take you to a link where you can download the book. And you can also find a link to it on my website, which is KeciaAli.com.
I am actually going to put a link to the book directly in the show notes of our podcast conversation. So anybody out there listening who is curious about the book, now that I know that this link is readily available, I'll just put a link to it in the show notes so that people can look at it in Apple or Spotify or wherever they're listening to the podcast. I'm wondering.
Sounds great. So let me just then, since you're going to do that,
sure,
put in a pitch while people are there. An earlier collective publication that some colleagues and I put together in honor of Dr. Amina Wadud called A Jihad for Justice is also accessible at the same open access repository.
Awesome. That'll be there too. Fabulous. We'll put them all in the show notes. So check those out, everybody. Where else? I know you mentioned your website, KeciaAli.com. Where else can people find you if they want to follow you for any other commentary or work that you're putting out?
I am on Twitter. I'm not sure that it's super useful all the time, but I'm definitely around there. And if you're in the Boston area, you take a class at Boston University.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Kecia Ali, this has been a real pleasure. I have loved our conversation today. Thank you so much for spending this time with me this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.